Hello, BookTube. I am doing a chapter-by-chapter read-through of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Having a blast doing it. I started out with doing this on the Two Towers with David Wiley and Tony from An Erudite Adventure. And the idea was that we would do sort of a quasi-distant buddy read of this thing and synopsize what we think of the various chunks of chapters. David even worked it out, 5 or 6 chapters per week in 1 month. And I disobeyed that right away. Started talking about 1 chapter a day, except for yesterday when we talked about 2. The military climax, the battlefield climax of the first half of The Return of the King, which is the part of Lord of the Rings that we're talking about now. I mentioned we are dealing here with the siege of Minas Tirith, the capital of the city of Gondor, which is the inheritance of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, one of our main characters in the Fellowship of the Ring. Unbeknownst to most of the people in Middle-earth, he is descended from an unbroken line of the heirs of Isildur. He is the actual hereditary king of Gondor, which has no king at present and hasn't for centuries. It has a steward, who is king in all but name, but does not sit on a throne. He sits on a chair below a conspicuously empty throne. And a main character hanging over the chapters that we're reading now is Denethor, who is the steward of Gondor, and also the father of Boromir, who was a member of the Fellowship of the Ring, and Faramir, who is a character that we meet later on in the books. He loved Boromir to distraction and isn't all that fond of Faramir, and he himself is a tremendously formidable figure. He might not be technically a king, but he acts like one in every way. And as Gandalf the Wizard points out, he is also, in him runs the true blood of Westerness. He is very much a throwback, in the way that so many characters are in Lord of the Rings, to grander days. He is an incredibly formidable figure, who's able basically to read the minds of weaker minds around him and to learn a lot. He seems to know more than he possibly can of things that are going on outside of his kingdom. And as many characters point out in the chapters that we're reading, his reason seems to have been unseated when he learned that his son Boromir was dead. We've already gone over the death of Boromir. That's what started us off with our read-along of the Two Towers. When Denethor learns that Boromir is dead, something in him seems to snap. He was never a very happy or welcoming figure before that, but now he is almost serpentine. He's acidic. And he doesn't like Gandalf at all, even though Gandalf is working to preserve the whole of Middle-earth. As Gandalf himself says, he also is a steward, just not of one city. And the conflict between the two of them is ruinous because Minas Tirith is under siege. The forces of Gondor, the forces of Sauron, the Dark Lord, the Lord of the Rings, from Mordor, have struck Minas Tirith in force, suddenly, from land and from sea. At first, it seems that way. At first, it seems that there's going to be an assault from the water as well as from land. And it looks disastrous. The forces are being led by the king of the Nazgul, who was once the Witch King of Angmar, a tremendously formidable, supernatural being who seems to drive everything before him in clouds of sheer terror. His natural enemy seems to be Gandalf, who has been returned to Middle-earth. He is reborn. He is much more powerful than Gandalf the Grey, who we meet in The Hobbit and see in the Fellowship of the Ring. It seems like his whole purpose for being in Gondor at this time is to fight the Witch King, who is beyond the power of any other person to do. But Gandalf is, in these chapters that we're reading, he is perpetually distracted from doing that. They meet at the gate of Minas Tirith, and we almost get that confrontation, and then the Witch King is called away to the battlefield by the arrival of the forces of Rohan under the leadership of King Theoden. We read that great passage about King Theoden yesterday. Theoden dies in combat, but the tide of battle unexpectedly turns. Through a combination of the efforts of Eowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan, who we saw earlier being denied a place in Aragorn's retinue. She wants to go to war. She doesn't want to stay at home with all the other women and the children. And he denies that to her. She goes anyway. She goes to war anyway in disguise and ends up on the battlefield facing the Witch King of Angmar herself. But she's not alone. Also, a little hobbit is with her. And that hobbit has in his possession a very old blade, a blade forged centuries ago by the men of Westerness. A blade that is so old and so steeped in history that it is possible, it is capable of hurting the Witch King of Angmar, and between the two of them, they kill the Lord of the Nazgul. Right at the same moment that the ships coming up from the sea that look like a separate arm of invasion are revealed to be under the command of Aragorn, who has used the army of the dead to commandeer this whole fleet of vessels and come to Gondor in its hour of need. So the chapter that we finished with last, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, is an amazing victory, one without Gandalf. Gandalf is not on the battlefield. He should be foremost, but instead he's not there at all. And in the chapter that we're reading today, the Pyre of Denethor, we learn why, which is that Denethor's mind has completely snapped. And he has ordered that gigantic pyre of wood be constructed for himself and his stricken son Faramir, who is still alive. Denethor plans on burning both of them, on immolating both of them. Gandalf comments a couple of times, when he learns about this, he comments a couple of times that this is exactly the kind of dissension that Sauron loves to sow in the ranks of his enemies. He says it twice. Even in the heart of our stronghold, the enemy has power to strike us, for his will it is that is at work. Work of the enemy. Such deeds he loves, friend at war with friend, loyalty divided in confusion of hearts. Gandalf saves Faramir from insane Denethor, and when that happens, Denethor reveals something that we could probably have guessed. He reveals that he has a Palantir, that the White Tower of Minas Tirith has always had a Palantir. They are 7 mystical stones. They are smooth orbs that appear indestructible, and that enable their users, if they are strong enough of will, to communicate at great distances between the other stones. We've already seen one, because one was in Orthanc, the tower of the evil wizard Saruman, and was thrown out of Orthanc and came into the possession of the good guys. Finally into the possession of Aragorn, whose property they technically are. He is the heir of Númenor, and judges himself strong enough to use the thing. And we can gather, as we've mentioned in a couple of recaps here, we can gather he does use the thing. Because another person who owns a Palantir is Sauron, the Lord of the Rings, in Mordor. And Aragorn uses the Palantir in order to show himself to Sauron. Not as his friends typically see him, but as the heir of Gondor, as Isildur's heir, as the heir of the person who cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger at the end of the Last Age. In other words, Aragorn gambles that knowing that Elendil's heir is alive will badly unsettle Sauron. It will obsess him, and it will badly knock him off his pins and needles. And that is essential. That is exactly what all our heroes want to do, because they are only a distraction, and they know it. They want Sauron to be distracted because, unbeknownst to Sauron, the Hobbit Frodo and his servant Sam are walking the One Ring into Mordor, into Sauron's own stronghold, in order somehow to get past all of its defenses, get it to Mount Doom, where it was forged, and destroy it. If Sauron regains the ring, then no force of arms on the battlefield will matter at all. It's imbued with a huge amount of his sorceress ability. If he gets it back, there is no hope of victory of any kind, sorceress or land-based. There is no hope of any kind. And everyone knows that, which is why this mission has been launched in the first place. It can't be won through force of arms. You can't send an army to get this thing to Mount Doom. It has to be done stealthily, and the stealthier the better, and the way to do that, to increase the odds here, is to distract Sauron by making him concentrate on the war at Minas Tirith. So Aragorn shows himself to Sauron, and it has the desired effect. It causes Sauron to unleash this gigantic hammer blow on the city. We saw Aragorn do that, and we saw him right after he uses the Palantir, and he seems exhausted. And we've already seen Denethor hide himself away in a secret tower and then come back from that tower looking extremely devastated. So the clues are there. If you were reading this for the first time, you could guess what was going on, and maybe the connection between what was going on and Denethor's weird behavior. But here we make it explicit, because Denethor shows them the Palantir. He is raving now at this point, and he shows them that he has had possession of this thing all along. He says, and here he's in the fullness of his wrath, And consciously or otherwise, Tolkien reverts to a very Middle Ages type diction. You're just going to have to put up with the these and the thous. Pride and despair, he cried. Didst thou think the eyes of the White Tower were blind? Nay, I have seen more than thou knowest, grey fool. He's talking to Gandalf. For thy hope is but ignorance. Go then and labor in healing. Go forth and fight. Vanity. For a little space you may triumph on a field, for a day, but against the power that now arises there is no victory. To this city only the first finger of its hand has yet been stretched. All the east is moving, and even now the wind of thy hope cheats thee and wafts up Anduin a fleet of black sails. Denethor doesn't know who's in charge of that fleet. He doesn't know that. The west has failed. It is time for all to depart who would not be slaves. And Gandalf says, such counsels will make the enemy's victory certain indeed. And Denethor responds, hope on then. Do not I know thee, Mithrandir? That's Gandalf's elven name. Thy hope is to rule in my stead, to stand behind every throne, north, south, or west. I have read thy mind and its policies. Do I not know that you commanded this halfling, that's a hobbit, here to keep silence? That you brought him hither to be a spy within my very chamber? And yet in our speech together I have learned the names and purposes of all thy companions. So, with the left hand thou wouldst use me as a little while as a shield against Mordor, and with the right bring up this ranger of the north to supplant me. Because Denethor has forgotten that Aragorn is not supplanting him. Denethor is not a king. He has been holding a kingdom in custody for when the king returns. But the battle is going on even while this scene is taking place. Gandalf should be on the battlefield. He says it himself many times. He laments, this is not where I should be. I'm being distracted here by the wiles of the enemy when I should be on the battlefield fighting the King of the Nazgul. Instead, while they're talking with Denethor, they hear that cry that we heard last time of the King of the Nazgul dying. The tide of the battle on the field is turning, whether Gandalf is there or not. And Denethor bolts away from everybody with a handful of servants in order to put himself on the pyre that he intended for himself and Faramir and burn himself alive. And he's holding the Palantir when he does it. We're told, let's see here. We're told that in future years, if someone could wrest the stone away, they would see the withered, flame-eaten hands gripping the stone. That's what they would look at. I want to try and find that passage if I can. Let me see here. Yes, and it was said that ever after, if any man looked in that stone, unless he had a great strength of will to turn it to other purpose, he saw only two aged hands withering in flame, which tells us a lot about the way the stones operate, but it also tells us that this stone survives. If it was destroyed in the pyre, there wouldn't be any stories about what you see when you look in it later on. There is at least the Palantirs survive the third age of man, but everyone's stunned by this, and Gandalf points out that it's not really that much of a revelation to him. After Denethor is dead, he points out, though the stewards deemed that it was kept secret only by themselves, long ago I guessed that here in the White Tower at least one of the 7 Seeing Stones was preserved. In the days of his wisdom, Denethor would not presume to use it to challenge Sauron, knowing the limits of his own strength. But his wisdom failed, and I fear that as the peril of his realm grew, he looked in the stone and was deceived. Far too often, I guess, since Boromir departed. He was too great to be subdued to the will of the dark power. He saw nonetheless only those things that the power permitted him to see. The knowledge which he obtained was, doubtless, often of use to him, yet the vision of the great might of Mordor that was shown to him fed the despair of his heart until it overthrew his mind. And here, one of the people in Gondor recalls a scene that we saw earlier, which is that they've sometimes seen him up in the high citadel, shut away from everyone else with strange lights playing, and that maybe that was him contesting with the enemy. It was in the very hour that Faramir was brought to the tower that many of us saw a strange light in the topmost chamber. But we have seen that light before, and it has long been rumored in the city that the Lord would at times wrestle in thought with his enemy, meaning Sauron. And that is the end of the chapter of the Pyre of Denethor, but it raises a few questions for me, as always, as this slow read-along is doing. First of all, one consideration, not really a question, but one consideration is that we are often influenced by the huge effect that looking into the Palantir has on a hobbit, on an untrained little hobbit, on Pippin. We tend to forget from that this thing, it's perilous, but it's not universally perilous. Look at all the people who have looked into the Palantir and still maintained a strength of will of their own. Aragorn looks into it, and although he says the experience is exhausting, his strength is enough to do it. Saruman, the evil wizard, looks into his own Palantir many, many times. Enough times so that he and Sauron are basically exchanging telegram notices between each other, one of which we hear, one of which is intercepted. And yet, Saruman is not completely transparent to Sauron, even with that connection. Sauron can't plumb the depths of his mind. Saruman's treachery is unknown to Sauron. Even with the Palantir, Saruman is still working a game of his own. He is still trying to find the ring on his own. And Sauron apparently does not know that. Same thing is true with Denethor. We're told that Denethor has been grappling with Sauron directly through the Palantir for a long time. And he does it very recently. He does it after he's talked to Pippin and Gandalf. After that scene that we saw yesterday, or the day before yesterday, where he knows the plan. He knows where the One Ring is. He knows that it's being walked into Mordor by a witless halfling, as he puts it. He knows that is happening. And we are told in this chapter and the previous time where that strange light in an upper chamber is mentioned, that he confronts Sauron through the Palantir after he knows that. And yet, it doesn't appear that Sauron knows. There's a great moment coming up at the end of this book where Sauron suddenly realizes where the ring is. He suddenly realizes the plan of his enemies. He does not appear to know it now, or his behavior would change. We see how he behaves when he learns it. He is not behaving that way now. Which means that even though he was grappling thought to thought through a Palantir with Denethor, he never learned it. Even when Denethor knows it and believes it to be the height of folly, he still doesn't reveal it to Sauron. He still keeps it from Sauron when it could easily have been learned or voluntarily shared. Denethor dies instead. And we have to guess that Sauron knows this, because Sauron would also see those withered hands when he looks in the direction of this particular seeing stone. Instead, Denethor dies. He doesn't jump off a parapet like he does in Peter Jackson's movie, but he dies, set afire of his own will. And it leads me to a disarming question to end our chapter today, which is Denethor, son of Ecthelion, the hero of The Lord of the Rings? He's not very nice. He's not very likable. He gets Gandalf's staff squarely in the face in the Peter Jackson movie. But is he the hero of this story? He's in full possession of the knowledge of the plans to destroy the One Ring. He knows the details in every way. And he keeps them from Sauron, even though he believes that plan is hopeless. He could have ruined everything. That would have been Sauron's victory. Sauron would have known right away, well, I don't need to worry about. I can send a token force to keep Minas Tirith busy. What I need to do is bring all of my 8 remaining riders back to Mordor and send 1 million trolls to every portal to my kingdom, find these 2 hobbits, and regain my ring. He doesn't know that. Denethor keeps that from him. So is Denethor the hero? Is that the case here? Oh, I don't know. But with the passing of Denethor and the turn of tide on the battlefield, we now get a classic movement in Tolkien. Tolkien is fond of climaxes and then falling action, which is a thing that is largely ignored now in modern storytelling. Modern storytellers, especially fantasy storytellers, know perfectly well the build up to a climax, but not the falling off. They don't tend to do that anymore, much less do it well. And it tends not to be understood by modern audiences, as the many separate endings to Peter Jackson's The Return of the King being mocked shows you clearly that audiences don't understand that either. But nevertheless, Tolkien is going to do that for a bit. He's given us a couple of rousing chapters, the split action at Minas Tirith, part of it on the battlefield, part of it in the chambers of Denethor. He's given us separate climaxes for those two plot lines. Now we're going to get some falling action as this half of the narrative winds down. So we're just going to keep going. The end is almost in sight. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. We'll be back next time for the House of Healing. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.